This is part 2 of chapter 7. The hills had been silent on the day Granny Aching died. Someone went up every day with fresh bread and milk and scraps for the dogs. It didn't need to be quite so often, but Tiffany had heard her parents talking, and her father had said, "We ought to keep an eye on Ma'am now." Today had been Tiffany's turn, but she'd never thought of it as a chore. She liked the journey. But she noticed the silence. It was no longer the silence of many little noises, but a dome of quiet all around the hut. She knew then, even before she went in at the open door and found Granny lying on the narrow bed. She felt the coldness spread through her. It even had a sound. It was like a thin, sharp musical note. It had a voice, too. Her own voice. It was saying, "It's too late. Tears are no good. There's no time to say anything. There are things to be done." Then she fed the dogs, who were waiting patiently for their breakfast. It would have helped if they had done something soppy, like whine or lick Granny's face, but they hadn't. And still Tiffany heard the voice in her mind. "No tears. Don't cry. Don't cry for Granny Aching." Now, in her head, she watched the slightly smaller Tiffany move around the hut like a little puppet. She tidied up the hut. Besides the bed and the stove, there really wasn't much else there. There was the clothes sack and the big water barrel and the food box, but that was it. Oh, and stuff to do with sheep was all over the place. Pots and bottles and sacks and knives and shears. But there was nothing there that said a person lived there, unless you counted the hundreds of blue and yellow Jolly Sailor wrappers pinned to one wall. She'd taken one of them down. It was still underneath her mattress at home, and she remembered the story. It was very unusual for Granny Aching to say more than a sentence. She used words as if they cost money. But there had been one day when she had taken food up to the hut, and Granny had told her a story. A sort of story. She'd unwrapped the tobacco and looked at the wrapper, and then looked at Tiffany with that slightly puzzled look that she uses, and says, "I must have looked at 1,000 of these things, but I never once saw his boat." And that's how she pronounced boat. Of course, Tiffany had rushed to have a look at the label, but she couldn't see any boat, any more than she could see anything else that was hidden in the pictures. "That's 'cause the boat is just where you can't see it," Granny had said. "He's got a boat for chasing the great white whale fish on the salt sea. Now he's always chasing it all around the world. It's called Mopey. It's like a beast, like a big cliff of chalk, I heard tell once, in a book." "Why is he chasing it?" Tiffany asked. "To catch it," Granny had said. "Oh, but he never will. The reason being the world is round like a big plate, and so is the sea, so they're always chasing one another, so it's almost like he's even chasing himself. You never want to go to sea, my Jigget. That's where worse things happen. Everyone says that. You stop along here, where the hill's in your bones." And that was it. That was one of the very few times Granny Aching had ever said anything to Tiffany that wasn't in some way about sheep. It was the only time she ever acknowledged that there was a world beyond the chalk. Tiffany used to dream about the Jolly Sailor chasing the whalefish in his boat, and sometimes the whalefish would chase her, but the Jolly Sailor always arrived in his mighty ship just in time, and the chase would start over again. Sometimes she'd run to the lighthouse and wake up just as the door swung open. She'd never seen the sea, but one of the neighbors had an old picture on a wall that showed a lot of men clinging onto a raft in what looked like a huge lake full of waves. She hadn't been able to see the lighthouse at all. And Tiffany had sat by the narrow bed and thought about Granny Aching and the little girl, Sarah Grizel, very carefully painting the flowers in that book, and about the world losing its center. She missed the silence. What there was now wasn't the same kind of silence as there was before. Granny's silence was warm, and it brought you inside. Granny Aching might sometimes have trouble remembering the difference between children and lambs, but in her silence you were always welcome, and you always belonged. All you had to do was bring a silence of your own. Tiffany wished that she'd had a chance to say sorry about the shepherdess. And then she went home and told everyone that Granny was dead. She was 7, and the world had ended. Someone was now tapping politely on her boot. She opened her eyes and saw the toad. It was holding a small rock in its mouth. It spat it out. "Sorry about that," it said. "I'd have used my arms, but we're a very soggy species." "What am I supposed to do?" said Tiffany. Well, if you hit your head on the low ceiling, you would have a definite claim for damages, said the toad. Did I just say that? Yes, and I really wish you hadn't, said Tiffany. Why did you say that? I don't know, moaned the toad. I'm sorry, what were we talking about? I meant, what do we do about the pixies? What do we do now? Oh, I don't think it works like that, said the toad. You're the Kelda. You say what has to be done. Why can't Fionn be the Kelda? She's a pixie. Can't help you there, said the toad. Can I be of service? Said a voice by Tiffany's ear. She turned her head and saw, on one of the galleries that ran around the cave, William the Gonigal. Up close he was noticeably different than the other Feagles. His hair was neater and braided into one pigtail. He didn't have as many tattoos. He spoke differently, too, more clearly and slowly than the others, sounding his R's like a drum roll. Yes, said Tiffany. Why can't Fionn be the Kelda here? William nodded. A good question, he said politely. But ye ken a Kelda cannot wed her brother. She must go to a new clan and wed a warrior there. Well, why can't the warrior just come here? Because the Feagles here would not know him, and they'd have no respect for him. William made respect sound like an avalanche. Oh, well, what was that about the Queen? You were going to say something and everyone stopped you. William looked embarrassed. Oh, I don't think I can tell you about. I am the temporary Kelda, said Tiffany stiffly. Aye. Well, there was a time when we lived in the Queen's world and we served her before she grew so cold, but she tricked us and we rebelled. It was a dark time, and she does not like us, and that is all I'll say, said William. Tiffany watched Feagles going in and out of the Kelda's chamber. Something was going on there. They're burying her in the other part of the mound, said William without being asked, with all the other Keldas in the clan. I thought they would be more noisy, said Tiffany. She was their mother, said William. They do not want to shout. Their hearts are too full to have any words. In time they will hold a wake to help her back to the land of the living, and that'll be a loud one, I can promise you. We'll dance the 512-some reel to the tune of the Devil Among the Lawyers, and then we'll eat and drink, and I dare say my nephews will have headaches the size of sheep. And the old Feagle smiled briefly. But for now, the Feagle remember her in silence. We dinna mourn like you do, Ken. We mourn for them that have to stay behind. Was she your mother too? Tiffany asked quietly. Nay, she was my sister. Did she not tell you that when a Kelda goes to a new clan, she takes a few of her brothers with her? To be alone among strangers would be too much for her heart to bear. The Gonigal sighed. Of course, in time, after the Kelda weds, the clan is full of her sons, and it's not so lonely for her. It must be lonely for you, said Tiffany. Well, you're a quick one, I'll grant you that, said William. I am the last of those who came, and when this is over, I'll seek to leave of the next Kelda to return to my own folk in the mountains. This is a fine, fat country, and this is a fine, bonny clan my nephews have, but I would like to die in the heather where I was born. And if you will excuse me, Kelda. He walked away and was then lost in the shadows of the mound. Tiffany suddenly wanted to go home. Perhaps it was just William's sadness, but now she felt shut up in the mound. I've got to get out of here, she muttered. Good idea, said the toad. You have to find the place where the time is different, for one thing. Yeah, but how do I do that? Wailed Tiffany. You can't see time. She stuck her arms through the entrance hole, and she pulled herself up to the fresh air. There was a big old clock in the farmhouse, and the time on it was set once a week. Well, that is, when her father went to the market in Creel Springs, he would make a note of the position of the hands on the big clock there. And when he got home, he moved the hands on their clock to the same position. It was just for show, anyway. Everyone took their time from the sun. The sun couldn't get it wrong. Now Tiffany lay among the trunks of the old thorn bushes, whose leaves rustled continuously into the breeze. The mound was like a little island in the endless turf. Late primroses and even a few ragged foxgloves grew up here in the shelter of the thorn roots. "She could have just told me where to look," said Tiffany. But she didn't know where it would be," said the toad. "She just knows the signs to look for." Tiffany rolled over carefully and stared up at the sky between the low branches. "It'll shine out," the Kelda had said. "I think I ought to talk to Hamish," she said. "Right ye are, mistress," said a voice by her ear, and she turned her head. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "Oh, all the time, mistress," said the pixies, and others poked their heads around the trees and out from under leaves. There were at least 20 on the mound. "You've been watching me all this time?" "Why, mistress, it's our task to watch over our Kelda. I'm up here most of the time anyway, 'cause I'm studying to become a gonagle." And the young Feegle flourished a set of mouse pipes. "And they will not let me play doon there on account of them saying that my playing sounds like a spider trying to fart through its own ears, mistress." "But what happens if I want to go to the what happens if I say I don't want you to guard me?" "If it's the wee call in nature that you're talking about, mistress, the clodgie's over there in the chalk pit. You'll just sing out to us where you're going, and no one will be a peeking. You have our word on it," said the attendant Feegle. Tiffany glared at him as he stood on the primroses, beaming with pride and anxious duty. He was younger than most of them, without as many scars and lumps. Even his nose wasn't broken. "What's your name, Pixie?" she asked. "Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock, mistress. There's not that many Feegle names, you ken, so we kind of have to share." "Well, not as big as little Jock," Tiffany began. "Oh, no, that'd be medium-sized Jock, mistress," said Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. "Well, not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock, I can—" "Oh, that's not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock, mistress," said Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. "You were just one Jock short," he said helpfully. "You wouldn't be happier with, say, Henry?" said Tiffany helplessly. "Oh, nay, mistress." Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock, wrinkled his face. "There's nae history to that name, ye ken, but there have been a number of brave warriors called Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. Why, 'tis nearly as famous a name as wee Jock itself. And, of course, should wee Jock himself be taken back to the last world, then I get the name wee Jock, which isn't to say that I mislike my name of Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. Ye ken, there's been many a fine story about the exploits of Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. The pixie added, looking so earnest that Tiffany didn't have the heart to say that they must have been very long stories. Instead, she said, well, please, I want to talk to Hamish the aviator." "No problem," said Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. "He's up there right noo." And he vanished. A moment later, Tiffany heard, or rather felt with her ears, the bubbling sensation of Feegle whistling. Tiffany pulled out Diseases of Sheep, which was now looking very battered, out of her apron, and there was one blank page in the back. She tore it out, feeling like a criminal for doing so, and then took out her pencil. "Dear Mum and Dad," she wrote carefully. "How are you? I'm well. Wentworth is also well, but I have to go fetch him from the Queen, where he is staying. I hope to be back soon. Tiffany. P.S. I hope the cheese is all right." She was just considering this when she heard the rush of wings overhead. There was a whirring noise, a moment of silence, and then a small, weary, and rather muffled voice said, "Ach, Crevens." She looked out onto the turf. The body of Hamish was upside down a few feet away. His arms with their twirlers were still outstretched. Now, no words can describe what a Feegle in a kilt looks like upside down, so we're not even going to try. It took some time to get him out. If he landed headfirst and spinning, Tiffany was told, he had to be unscrewed in the opposite direction so that his ears wouldn't come off. When he was upright and swaying unsteadily, Tiffany said, "Can you wrap this letter in a stone and drop it in front of the farmhouse where people will see it?" "Aye, mistress." "And, does it hurt when you land head first like that?" "Nay, mistress, but it's awful embarrassing." "Then there's this sort of toy that we used to make. It might help you," said Tiffany. "You make a kind of like a bag of air." "A bag of air," said the aviator, looking puzzled. "Well, you know how things like shirts will billow out on a clothesline when it's windy? Well, you just make a cloth bag and you tie some strings to it and then a stone to the strings, and then when you throw it up, the bag fills with air and then the stone floats down." Hamish stared at her. "Do you understand?" asked Tiffany. "Oh, I was just waiting to see if you were going to tell me anything else," Hamish said politely. "Do you think you could maybe borrow some fine cloth?" "Oh, nay, mistress. Oh, but I can well where I can steal some," said Hamish. Tiffany decided not to comment on this, so she said, "Where was the Queen when the mist came down?" Hamish pointed. "About a half-mile yonder, mistress." In the distance, Tiffany could see some more mounds and a few stones from the old days. Trilithons they were called, which just meant 3 stones. The only stones found naturally on the downs were flints, but these giant stones of the trilithons had been dragged from at least 10 miles away, and they were stacked like a child stacks brick toys. And here and there the big stones had been stood in circles. Sometimes one stone had been placed all alone. It must have taken a lot of people a long time to do that. Some people said that there had been human sacrifices up there. Some said they were part of an old religion, and some said they just marked ancient graves. Some said they were a warning. Avoid this place. Tiffany hadn't. She'd been there with her sisters a few times as a dare, just in case there were any skulls. But the mounds around the stones were thousands of years old. All that you found there now were rabbit holes. "Anything else, mistress?" said Hamish politely. "Nay? Oh, then I'll just be going." He raised his arms over his head and he started to run across the turf. Tiffany jumped as the buzzard skimmed down a few feet away from her and snatched him back up into the sky. "How can a man 6 inches high train a bird to do that?" she asked as the buzzard circled again for height. "Ah, all it takes is a wee drop o' kindness, mistress," said Not As Big As Medium-Sized Jock But Bigger Than Wee Jock Jock. "Really?" "Aye, oh, and a big dollop of some cruelty," Not As Big As Medium-Sized Jock But Bigger Than Wee Jock Jock said. "Hamish trains him by running around in a rabbit skin until the bird pounces on him." "That sounds awful," said Tiffany. "Ah, oh, but he's not too nasty about it. He just knocks 'em out with his head, and then he's got a special oil he makes which he blows up their beak," Not As Big As Medium-Sized Jock But Bigger Than Wee Jock Jock went on. "When he wakes up, they thinks he's their mammy, and they'll just do his bidding." The buzzard was already a distant speck. "He hardly seems to spend any time on the ground," said Tiffany. "Oh, aye, he sleeps in the buzzard's nest at night, mistress. Says it's wonderfully warm. Oh, and he spends a lot of his time up in the air," Not As Big As Medium-Sized Jock But Bigger Than Wee Jock Jock added. "He's never happy unless he's got the wind under his kilt." "The birds don't mind?" "Och, no, mistress. All the birds and beasts up here know it's good luck to be friends with the Knack McFeegle." "They do?" "Well, to tell you the truth, mistress, it's more that they know it's unlucky not to be friends with the Knack McFeegle." Tiffany looked at the sun. It was only a few hours away from setting. "I have to find a way in," she said. "Look, not as big as medium-sized Jock But Bigger Than Wee Jock Jock, mistress," said the pixie patiently. Yes, thank you. "Where's Rob, anybody? Where's everybody, in fact?" The young pixie looked a bit embarrassed. "Well, there's a bit of a debate going on down below, mistress," he said. "Well, we have to find my brother, okay? I mean, I am the Kelda in this vicinity." "It's a wee bit more complicated than that, mistress. They're discussing what about me? Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock. Jock looked as if he really did not want to be standing there. They're discussing, Tiffany gave up. The Pixie was now blushing. Since he was blue to begin with, this turned him a very unpleasant violet color. I'll just go back down the hole. Just give my boots a push, will you? And she slid down the dry dirt, and Feegle scattered in the cave below where she landed. And that is the end of part 2 of chapter 7.